So let's talk about doing a drawing of this daisy. The reason that I'm looking at this flower in particular is the fact that it's got some really nice flowing petals, and I noticed that a lot of students tend to ignore or at least downplay the importance of how these petals flow through space, and so they will often end up drawing really shallow flow lines when they're constructing them, or they'll skip that part entirely. So I wanted to create a demo that would kind of accentuate and emphasize the importance of flow. So what is the flow of a petal? The flow of a petal is basically the energy that drives it through space. When you have a flat form, it's not going to have the same kind of solidity as, say, a box or something, with weight to it. Instead, it is influenced so much by its surrounding forces, so like the wind and air currents and stuff, that it's not solidity that characterizes it. Instead, it's the fact that it follows these external flows. And so when we're drawing a petal, what we're really doing is we're drawing something that represents and captures outside forces. Because of that, it's really important to acknowledge that these leaves and petals, that they have a clear sense of directionality to them. And really that they're much more than just a static object with a clear starting point and an end point. It's not just, from here to here. It's a piece of a much larger flowing force. And so that's what we're trying to capture in how we draw these leaves and petals. And even if a petal doesn't have this kind of clear flow to it, like a clear directionality, even if it's a smaller petal, something like this, it still is very worthwhile to actually try and either find the flow that's pushing it, or even invent it yourself. So if you can exaggerate a sense of flow to it, it can really help push the idea that this is a flat flowing shape. And the last thing I wanted to say is you'll notice that I often draw these little arrowheads at the end of the lines that I draw when I'm doing my flow, and you'll see that in a lot of my other drawn demos. It's because it always reminds me that this is not the end, the beginning and the end of this line. It is a representation of something that flows continuously. And it's just the visible part of it. So let's take this reference image and move it aside. So with these demos, I've drawn them all beforehand, and I'm just going to step through them, and we'll talk about what I'm doing, and it'll give me the opportunity to talk about certain decisions that I made and what I'm thinking about without at the same time trying to balance drawing it live. So to start with, this daisy clearly has a stem, and even though we can't see the stem through this section here, that doesn't mean that we don't have to be aware of it. We know, based on our logic and intuition, that this stem connects to a larger element from which all these petals come out. And so here I've drawn just how it's going to connect to this larger bulb, because there is a bigger form here, and we just want to make sure that we're connecting to it at a specific location. Construction is very much about not just drawing simple forms, but also understanding how they relate to each other. And so this contour ellipse here gives me a sense of grounding in terms of how the branch or stem that I'll be drawing here actually connects to the rest of it. And so next, using the branch method, which is from the branches exercise earlier in lesson 3, we are going to construct the remainder of the stem. Now you'll see that this stem gets cut off here. And down here, I've capped it off with an ellipse. Never leave your three-dimensional objects just open-ended like this. If you do, it will just completely flatten out that form. So even if you have a cylinder here, and even if you have these contour curves or contour ellipses, if you leave this open, it's really going to undo a lot of what you're doing here, and you're going to be fighting against it. So just capping it off, even if it continues on below, you still want to give it a clean cut and then reinforce it by capping it off. And so just like in the branches exercise, we've constructed a series of ellipses, and then we've connected them by well, it was along a minor axis line. So each ellipse is aligned to this minor axis. And we're constructing it in segments because we can control those segments better, but we have to make sure that we still draw these segments with a confident stroke and aim as we pass this second ellipse. It's like we're playing connect the dots, but we're going past it. We're going past the second ellipse and aiming towards the third, because the next line should pass directly on top of this first one, creating the illusion that they are continuous. Now you'll see that my trajectory here was actually off. It was aiming slightly below, and so I missed this one. And so I might have, corrected like that, but then I would have had a little arm sticking out, which, it happens. But the more that you practice with it, the more you're able to blend them together. And of course, I'm just adding little arrowheads to show you guys where these lines are ending. That's not something that you have to do here, but in general, because we're not focusing on the end result, adding those arrowheads can actually help you remind yourself to constantly draw these lines as confidently and smoothly as you can, because you're really pushing that energy and that flow. And so even if you have a bunch of little arrowheads scattered in these construction lines, it's not a big deal, because the construction and the process of construction is what's important here. And so in this next step, I am creating the bulb of the, you see a bunch of little bits here. I'll increase the size of this reference again. So you can see all these little things here, these little, I don't know what they are, probably they're seeds or pollen or something to that effect. And so there's a bunch, there's a lot going on here, but really it's arranged in one big ball or, hemisphere. So we can create this dome and just leave it like that for the time being. And you'll see that I've created another contour ellipse along the top here. That is just to help reinforce the illusion of form. And so if I am drawing a ball, it's a lot like I can work with this because I myself believe that it is a sphere. And so if I were to draw anything along it, it's all going to run along the surface of that form instead of just running across it. So those little things that I do later on will help continually reinforcing the same illusion. But it does help still to draw contour lines along it to help reinforce that illusion now, so that if your belief in that illusion is not as strong as it could be, this will help remind you that you're drawing on a sphere, not on a two-dimensional circle or ellipse. And so these kinds of, it's kind of like the pole on a globe, where you may have a pole up here and then all your, I can never remember if it's longitude or latitude that goes down this way, but, and then this would be on the opposite side, which we cannot see because it's pointing away from us. This is pointing towards us. But it's like the poles on a globe, which help. Even that tiny little contour ellipse will do so much to help build that illusion of form rather than 2D shape. Now I've drawn out all of my flow lines for these petals. Now we could have gone in and drawn a big encompassing ellipse to kind of define the bounds of where we want to put these. Sometimes it can be helpful, other times I skip it. It's not always the most important thing, as long as you are used to keeping your flow lines a consistent distance, or at least as far away as they need to go. The real importance here still is how these lines flow. If you go through the trouble of defining your bounds, but then draw a bunch of lines that are just flat and with shallow curves, that's not going to give you a very strong construction. But if instead you're drawing, even without those bounds, if you're drawing nice, curving, energetic, confident lines to define the flow, then you're going to be putting yourself in a much better position. So you can see that here, each one is smooth and confident, and I'm not stressing too much about reproducing this image. That's not what we're here to do. We're here to use this image as a subject matter through which to exercise and practice our construction skills. So if our result doesn't look just like this, that doesn't matter. And you'll find that my drawings rarely look just like my reference, because that's not what I'm striving to do. I'm striving to construct based on the information that I'm given here. I'm more interested in how these forms relate to each other and how they exist in space than whether or not they're perfectly replicating this image. This really just gives us something to draw, and it gives us information that we don't necessarily start out with in terms of how all the components that exist in a flower and so on. And so now, for each of these, I have drawn a petal. Now, I usually try and get the end of this petal to line up right with the end of the flow line. In many of these, I didn't actually manage that too successfully. I am still more interested in drawing those lines with the same kind of confidence and ghosting as is needed. But ultimately, I would prefer for this to have ended at the end of the flow line. But at the end of the day, it's not that big of a deal. Just strive for it. Don't worry if you miss it. You'll notice here I've got these flow lines that curve around. Be mindful of the fact that this is where you're basically establishing that these petals and leaves, they fold over themselves. And so the way I drew these, if I draw a folding thing here, I actually continued along like that. I bent them over as well, and then I bridged. Well, in this case, it would have actually been more like this. And then I bridge this part here. So I'm not doing anything particularly fancy. I'm really just following my flow line as I always would. So don't be afraid of letting these things fold over themselves. And in general, I do like to keep my leaves started at points, even if it's penetrating into this bulb here. I prefer not to leave them squared off like this or open. In general, it just contributes better to the sense of completeness and the leaf being enclosed fully. So that's usually what I strive to do. And of course, you should too. And so now I'm less worried about these details here, but I'm still going to drop them in. And so, as you saw before, they were these little clusters of pollen and I don't know, whatever else is there. And so I'm capturing these as simple balls for now. Additionally, you've got a lot of extra lines running along the surface of the form. These can be very useful because they give you additional contour lines to reinforce the overall construction. These should still be drawn with the same confidence and flow as that initial flow line. You're just reinforcing it even more. And that can help a lot. Don't allow yourself to get lazy and just do a stiff, simple line. follow the flow and the surface of this form, because you're really reinforcing that by creating these contour lines that will run along the surface, and by doing so, describe how that surface moves through space. And finally here, I've added detail. I'm going to remove the red because it's just kind of bad looking. But what I've done here is a few things. First of all, I'm using cast shadows to separate these forms where appropriate. Don't go overboard with that, and be careful of where you put it. Usually when I'm adding a cast shadow, I will use my regular pen to define its outline, and then I'll use a brush pen to fill it in, because brush pens fill the black in much more easily. You want to avoid a situation where you're getting outside the lines. I know that's kind of grade school, but try and I mean, that's why we established the outline of our shadow, and then try and stay inside of it as best as you can, even though the brush pen might be a little bit more difficult to handle at first. And always still make those confident strokes, even if they're little. Confidence behind those strokes will allow you to maintain smooth edges rather than little, choppy nonsense that makes the edges of the shadow uneven. And so the reason that we want to fill it in with something like a brush pen or a thicker pen or whatever you have on hand, but the point is that we want to avoid situations where you are trying to do it with a narrow pen and you end up with a lot of very tiny specks of white. These little bits of white can be very distracting because they have a lot of contrast to them, with a lot of white and black next to each other. And so that's going to call out to the viewer's eye. They're going to see all these white and black things very densely packed, and it'll draw their attention. And you want to be able to control exactly what is drawing the viewer's eye. So generally these things, you want them to be solid black because that doesn't have any contrast to it. And so we're adding cast shadows. I'm fussing a little bit with texture. I'm really just implying that, there's these little kind of ridges on the petals that kind of flow in the direction of the flow line here. I also added little pits and divots, basically anything that you can see on here, but don't go overboard, because if you start fussing too much with your texture, you're really there's a lot of opportunities where you can contradict what you've put down in your construction. At no point should your texture ever contradict what you've constructed and what these construction lines that you've put down are suggesting. Remember that construction is basically a series of answers to spatial questions. So for example, how far out does this leaf go? Well, it goes all the way out to here, and we've decided that from this flow line. And so when I draw that leaf, I'm not drawing it like this because the question was already answered with this, and I don't want to answer it again. So I stick to that. Next, maybe how do these surfaces like bow out? The leaf dips. I'm communicating to the viewer that the leaf dips in like this. And so I might add a few contour lines to suggest that. But what if then I added texture that, because I was really, really gung-ho about, I don't know what I was doing, maybe, some haphazard scribbling. If I did this, it would immediately contradict the curvature of these initial contour lines. And this, when you have a lot of competing information, some that says one thing, other bits that say another thing, that's when a construction falls apart. So you want all of those answers to all be in sync, because you're essentially creating a lie, as I explained in lesson 2. You're creating an illusion and you're telling a lie, and when you tell this lie, your story needs to be straight. You can't be telling a bunch of different stories simultaneously. So that's really the end of it. I don't want you to get too caught up in texture, not only because of what I mentioned before, but because Oftentimes students will get distracted by texture and they'll rush into it without fully figuring out their construction. You can really take that construction just about all the way, and that's a flower. It helps a lot to have the extra cast shadows separating out your forms, but all of these little bits here don't contribute much to our understanding of how these objects sit in space. So add a little bit of texture if you really want to, but don't go overboard with it. And remember that this is not the focus. We are not here to create pretty drawings to pin on our fridge. We're here to learn about how to apply construction. We're not here to learn how to draw flowers and plants. We're using them as an example and as a subject matter by which to practice construction. So I hope that helped. Remember, above all, I know I've said it so many times already, but when you're creating anything that is flat, it's going to represent the flow of energy and forces that are applied to it, whether it's wind or the general airflow or whatever else. You need to be drawing those flow lines confidently, and you need to abide by them. You can't just draw that flow line for your leaf and then ignore it by, I don't know. You have to follow it, because once you've put it down, you've answered that question, you've made that decision, and you need to stick to it, even if it makes it differ from this reference image. So I'll leave it at that. There will be a full text breakdown with step-by-step images of what I'm doing here for this demo, and I'll put that link in the description to accompany this.